This is Damien Marie AtHope, and I am an axiological atheist, which can simply be understood as a value theory or a value science atheist. Or another way is almost any evaluative property in philosophy can be evaluated through axiology. I'm here with a guest. Could you go ahead and tell us your name and a little bit about you?
Yeah, good morning, Damien, and
good morning,
everyone. My name is Bernard Lamborelle. I'm the author of The Covenant on the Origin of the Abrahamic Faith. It's a historical essay in which I attempt to demonstrate or provide arguments, anyway, argue that Abraham did exist, but made a covenant with an overlord at a time when powerful people were deified, and that better explains the origin of the Abrahamic faith. I guess I was raised in a mixed family with a father that was mostly skeptic and a mother that was mostly a believer, and so I was kind of raised in between those two poles, and I've always been interested in religion. I've got a an engineering degree in automated production. And actually, this journey started almost 15 years ago. And about 10 years ago, I published a first book at a time when I didn't have much method, but just was compiling arguments and initial thoughts on the subject. And I was challenged to deepen my work and explain well, because at the time I had only focus on the story of Abraham itself, and I was challenged to explain, well, how does that fit in the great picture? How do we go from Abraham to where we are today, and what's the path between those two? And that's what I did in the second book, The Covenant there. So that's a brief summary, very brief summary.
Okay. So would you say that you're an atheist or a theist, or how would you define yourself? Or do you not?
Well, I started out as an agnostic, I guess, and evidence brought me to realize that certainly I'm not totally rejecting the idea of call it a universal consciousness or whatever, but I have no evidence for that. So yeah, you can certainly define myself. I would define myself more as an atheist, secular humanist, and I like your idea of axiology, but I think we have to look for evidence and try to provide rational explanation for what we have today.
Right, and axiology definitely does that. It evaluates, but axiology relates to God specific. One of the things that makes it different than some people say axiology, atheism sounds a lot like secular humanism. Well, I would say probably secular humanism is using some of axiological atheism's ideas. Axiological atheism, in a sense, if axiology is placed in a sense towards theism, it would be the belief that theism is good. It's an evaluation that's the conclusion. And then axiological agnosticism is basically that you evaluate, you try to evaluate, and you realize you don't have any information to build a support for a good God, so you're neutral. You don't know if God is good or bad in a sense. And axiological atheism is almost like secular humanism, but it's anti-theism as its main goal. Anti-theism is part of axiological atheism's thing, that when you axiologically evaluate the goodness properties of what they call, or the concept of gods, or what people call gods, that it sees them as negative, as in a sense. And I would say the simplest way to understand that is that the concept of God is a label. It's not a name. Like God is not a name, it's a label. It's a classification of a type of thing. And generally this type of thing is able to, in a sense, violate human rights or wills, most of the deity beliefs, without our control. And we're supposed to do what the deity wants, like celestial North Korea. We're supposed to do what the deity wants, or else we're punished. So, in a sense, it's anti-humanism to me as an axiological atheist, because the concept of God is the violation of human rights, instead of where believers would see as that God is the producer of human rights. I see it the exact opposite. Well, actually, if there was a God and he could actually remove human rights and tell us how to live our lives, we wouldn't have our own rights, and thus we would have, an anti-humanism position. So, but exactly. Axiology evaluates a lot more than just that. Because it's an evaluative. It judges what is good, bad, truth, accuracy. It's all about evaluation. The processes of doing it. But anyway, so I wanted to talk about your beliefs. So you wrote your first book and you started it, you said, with arguments. And when you mean arguments, could you classify what you mean by an argument?
Well, for me, I mean, it's basically looking at the available set of data and try to explain, what's the hypothesis that best explains, that accounts for the set of available facts. And, the hypothesis, basically what I do is, first of all, maybe I should talk a little bit about how that came to be. And I was kind of reading the story of Abraham, and I just had this weird feeling that Abraham was talking with a powerful overlord, or having that the story felt like instead of meeting with a god, he was actually meeting with somebody important. And
question real quick. But there's a definitely in the story, I think it's Genesis 12 or maybe it's 11, where he talks about that he is living in Huron, which is southeastern Turkey, and with his father and Lot and his wife, and that he gets a dream. No, he gets it. Well, it says he gets a dream. He comes to him in a dream, whatever. And so, are you saying that that's a form of herotheism? That he was having a dream of an actual person that he was deifying, or had been deified in a sense?
I think that particular verse, there are just a handful of verses that I believe have been added, editorialized after the fact, and I think that's one of them. Same thing with Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, and there's a couple of verses that are harder to account for when you take the perspective of a secular covenant.
But when you mean by secular means non-religious. If you deify a human being, that's herotheism, and that's a actual form of theism. It's a form of in a sense. So, but once it becomes that's not secular. Secular is non-religious. It means issues that relate to non-religious things. So as soon as you add religion, you're no longer to me, the concept of secular religion in a sense would be almost doesn't make sense, because you're referring to something that's non-religious as religion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea is that what I believe and what I'm arguing is that the story of Abraham itself, the story started out as just a secular covenant.
And why do you think that? Because like I said, you said you were reading. I'm just saying, if you're reading, to me, the whole story of Abraham is nonsense. I think that none of it is almost true. It probably, even if there was some sort of a person it was trying to base off of, I think that it's ludicrous. And he goes to Egypt, right? Remember that verse? He goes to Egypt, and his wife at 70 is so beautiful the king can't. Seriously, 70? I mean, to me, the whole story is just ludicrous. What? And then he is sick because of the wife. The Pharaoh does. Which, how is he talking to the Pharaoh king, anyways? And then once he gets sick, he gives him more land and tells him to go. I mean, and sheep or goats. I mean, what? The whole thing just sounds a nutcase to me. I mean,
well, I think the way I'm approaching it is, if Abraham made a covenant with a Lord, and if you look, so I guess you have to first step back and look at the big picture of what the story of Abraham tells us. And I think when you what I'm trying to argue is that quite early on in the story, as you say, Abraham is sent to Canaan. There's this famine that pushes them to Egypt, returns to Canaan, and then he decides to separate, and Lot goes to Sodom.
Right.
And at this point in the story, there's the chapter Genesis 14, where you have the people of Sodom have been vassal to Mesopotamian kings for 12 years, and they decide to revolt. And
But hold on, you're saying that 4,000 years ago, right? Because when are you placing? First off, when are you placing? Because when you say that they were vassal, that's a certain time frame. So when are you saying that occurred? The reason I ask is because the Bible kind of references about 4,000 years ago. And to me, DNA of the Ashkenazi Jews actually traces 4,000 years ago to Lake Van region of eastern Turkey, which and they break off from the Kurds at that time. They have a shared ancestry in a sense. But so the story to me says 4,000 years ago, someone came from Turkey, ends up in Israel. I'm like, wow, the DNA seems to reference something close to that. So I think that there, in a sense, like in that sense, there may be a, pseudo kind of a historic, event happened where people left an area and, migrated.
Move into.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the.
And then later they made a myth about it, is what I would say to me. So you say it's a real person, so you're not talking probably 4,000 years ago, or are you? Because you said 4,000 years ago.
I'm talking about 3,500 years ago, which is pretty close. Not quite.
Well, but 500 years is. But you're saying it's 35 because a lot of the contemporary people believe that the stories probably relate to 2,500 or something like that. So.
Yes. Yeah, to the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, correct.
Most people would think that's where the story.
And you feel it was 1,000 years before that.
Yeah, basically in the time of King Hammurabi, which is what, interestingly, that's what the Jewish tradition tells us. But I didn't look at or didn't care that much for Jewish tradition per se. I'm looking into facts. But what we have in the story of Abraham, and the point I'm trying to get at is that the people of the whole story of Abraham, and the reason there's a covenant made is to keep the valley of Siddim, which is essentially the trade corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Right.
Mesopotamia was controlling that region and wanted to maintain that door under control. And in Genesis 14, we have the people of Sodom that are revolting, and they don't want to be vassal of Mesopotamian kings anymore. And when Lot is, so they send a punitive campaign, and when Lot is taken away, this is when Abraham essentially pursues those kings, chases them, defeats them.
So hold on a second. So, but if he's relating to the Mesopotamian kings, as you said, King Hammurabi, you're saying that the Mesopotamian king that he supposedly is, in a sense, fighting against is also the one he's deifying, right?
Yes.
I mean, that makes sense to you? That doesn't make sense to me, to think that the person that I am supposedly warring against, that I am also deifying that king.
Well, I mean, obviously the story evolves. So, in Genesis 14, there's this.
But hold on a second. You get that's a claim. The story evolved. How do you know that? I'm just saying.
Well, just looking at the story.
Looking at the story.
So,
well, I look at the story. Like I said, I can tell that it's a bizarre story that doesn't sound very true. I mean, the guy is supposedly 75 before he starts to do all this stuff, and then he ends up living till I think it was like 150 or something like that, or 200 or
175.
175, yeah.
So, but again, so let me lay out the arguments one after another.
Okay.
So in Genesis 14, we have this punitive campaign, and Abraham defeats these kings and returns victorious. So this is, Mesopotamian army back then was one of the most powerful armies. So you would expect, if that story took place, you would expect a retaliation or something. You expect to hear back from those kings. And that's Genesis 14. Genesis 15, we have a covenant made with God. And my argument is that essentially after defeating these Mesopotamian king, which are coming from a faraway distance, right? Mesopotamia is 800 kilometers away from there. And,
probably farther, because if you understand, people didn't go over the mountains through the desert to get to Mesopotamia. They went to Turkey and then back down, like the Crescent.
Or perhaps Palmyra.
Or what?
But Palmyra.
Well, my point is that they're not generally going over the mountains and through the desert. So even though it looks like the distance you would, naturally travel, because both the things are, like this, but you're actually going up and back down. Because one of the reasons is you have water, like, the river that goes all the way to Turkey, the Tigris and Euphrates.
Yeah. But what, the thing is, we're at a point in the story where you would expect either retaliation or a covenant to be made, and yet the covenant is made later in the story.
So does it say particularly, I don't believe so, that the kings were Mesopotamian kings? I think it's like it says Khazar. What's that?
Eastern kings. 4 Eastern kings. But in Genesis 19, we have the people of Sodom that are still unrest. So God is still unpleased with the situation in Sodom and decides to, basically tells Abraham that he wants to destroy the city, and then Abraham is arguing with God that, well, maybe, what if we find some justs, just like a handful of just, and the Lord agrees that if we find a handful of just, and the way I'm reading the story is that just means they're willing to submit to this authority. And, because essentially Abraham makes a covenant with this foreign king in exchange for the land of Canaan, right? And so Abraham is seen as a traitor to the people of Sodom, because he's now the ally of this king who defeated them, and they've been revolting against. And so when the king wants, or when the Lord wants to destroy the city of Sodom because they're still revolting, Abraham tries to intercede in the favor of Sodom, and the king agrees that if he sends his messenger and he finds that there are enough people willing to submit, that he will not destroy the city. And then there's some messengers that are sent to the city that are being sodomized. Why are they sodomized? Because they represent this authority. And the people of Sodom, I believe, are basically saying or telling these messengers, I'm going to show you what it feels like to be submitted and to be...
That's your, in a sense, interpretation of the story. But the story in the Bible talks about angels, coming from the Lord and stuff. So
angels in the English translation. In Hebrew, it's malaka. And malaka, even an angel in Greek is a messenger. And melek is a king in Hebrew, and malaka is the messenger, the king. So we see them with wings.
Well, it definitely makes me. I still don't agree that that's probably so, because they definitely knew the difference between an angel and not an angel in the Bible. But I will definitely, because you said that, go and look up. I have a translation in actual Hebrew, word for word, of the whole New Testament. It makes me want to go look at what you said. No, I'm serious. I'm going to do it.
No, absolutely. Please do, because the more you're going to dig into it, the more you're going to realize that this interpretation, and that's the whole argument of this book, is to go down to the detail and to show that not only at a macroscopic level, you can now make sense of the story. So I totally agree that in a religious, when you look at the story and you think this is the story of Abraham making a covenant with a God, first of all, you can't set it in that time frame. Second of all, the story is weird and doesn't make any sense, and so on. But when you...
Right, but one question real quick. The moment that you move dates in the Bible, you actually ruin a whole bunch of stuff in the Bible, because they try to put it in even though they don't give like dates per se, they give, how long this person lived, how long this person lived, which I mean, right. You're both agree. I mean, I don't think the Bible's an actual historical thing, so you're agreeing that it's not historical because all the stories can't match up, especially if you change time, 1,000, 2,000 years.
I think it is more historical than a lot of people would give credit to. I'm not saying it's...
A lot of people as in who? Like as in historians or archaeologists?
Most biblical scholars and archaeologists, yeah.
Think of the Bible as historical? As in how? I have a whole blog that explains how archaeology debunks the Bible. How there was never any mass exodus from Egypt. How a lot of the wars they talk about didn't happen. The conquering of Canaan did not happen. So, I mean, archaeologically, I mean, this is the point too. That's like saying, I'm just making a point. Saying there is a historical thing is not the same thing as calling it historical. In other words, like we could say that Spider-Man is a somewhat historical. It mentions, skyscrapers. It mentions cities that we have now and cars and stuff. So it is a semi-historical thing. That doesn't make it a historical document. I see the Bible is the same way. Mentioning a few things that are in reality and then filling it full of absolute nonsense didn't somehow make it a historical book. So you saying that most historians or archaeologists, wow, I don't think so.
Okay, so let me try to.
Maybe it's how you stated it is the issue. Could you please explain?
Okay, so again, I always start from the same premise. Abraham made a covenant with a Mesopotamian overlord or Babylonian.
Yeah, but why? So why that premise? How is that?
Why that premise? Because I came to that. I came to the evidence, and now I can use that as a premise instead of saying, because most people take the premise Abraham makes a covenant with a god. We could say why is that? Why do we make that premise in the book, right? So I take the different approach, which is this God was immortal, and so that's my premise. And then
but just taking a premise, that's like ancient aliens. If you explain it, and there was a thing called aliens, if they actually did land on the Earth, it sounds somewhat reasonable for how you get to religion, but it's not actually reasonable because there is no evidence of aliens landing. There's no evidence of aliens doing anything with humans or some extra human knowledge or anything.
Exactly.
So even though the premise sounds reasonable, in other words, if you say, oh, well, things were flying in the sky, and that's why people thought they were angels, or, they came down, and so they thought these were gods, because to them it worked. The premise, it sounds reasonable, but it's actually inaccurate.
Exactly. So that's the whole point. The whole point is that there's no evidence. I believe there's evidence for a historical case. For instance, we know that Babylonians, back in the Bronze Age, were not using decimal as a numeric, to calculate their math. They were using sexagesimal. And I believe that at the time the Bible was collated, during the Babylonian exile, that the scribes who had access to more ancient documents failed to properly convert the numbers, and basically they took numbers that were in sexagesimal numeration and they poorly converted them to what they thought was decimal.
And just a good question. So is there historians who agree with that position?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So, and could you give me those links? I'll put them in the video also.
Yeah. Forgive me. I'm citing one of them in my book here.
Yeah, I don't know about that either way because I look at more of the archaeology of religion, not really what
The idea that sexagesimal was used and was poorly converted, that is a known fact. What is not known, or what I'm suggesting, is the fact that just looking for. Okay, here we go. Is the idea that we can fix it. So, Jesus. Okay, there we go. So, George Sarton, he's one of them. In 1993, he wrote Ancient Science Through the Golden Age of Greece. And he basically says the Greeks inherited the sexagesimal system from the Sumerian, but mixed it up with the decimal system, using the former only for submultiples of the unit and the later for multiples, and thus they spoiled both systems and started a disgraceful confusion, of which we're still the victims. Anyway, it goes on and explains that, there were issues in conversion. And I found two extra-biblical, if you want, ancient texts. One is a tablet from Nabonidus, and the other one from Nabucodonosor I, who the math are just wrong. Like Nabonidus says that Uriash lived 700 years after Hammurabi, and even Ryot, which is an Egyptologue, says, yeah, they didn't know how to calculate properly. Well, that's wrong. They knew how to calculate, it's just that they miscalculated. And I give a very simple example, because that's one of the challenges that people were challenging me. They said, well, how do you know they misconverted? And how can you explain psychologically a simple reason as to why they did that? And the best example I think I found is the fact that Babylonians were using base 60, right? So, and this is the reason on your watch today you have 60 minutes and 60 seconds as opposed to 100, right? Because we use 100 for everything else as a measure, as a base measurement. But they use 60 and 360 degree, and we've kept that for arithmetics and geometry. But if you have a watch today, and I tell you, I've created a watch, and instead of dividing my watch in 60 minutes, I divide it in 100 minutes. And I say, Damien, let's meet in a quarter of an hour, right? So on your watch, that'll be 15 minutes. On my watch, that'll be 25 minutes. That's a quarter of an hour on our respective watch. You agree with that?
But the issue really goes back to just like I said about the times. The moment that you mess with the times, then anything you think is historical, right? You now have to move from the 4,000 to what you said is 2,500. So that alone moves all the dates, not just one date, all the dates. Since most of the Bible is from Genesis on, is talking about stuff, the ages and everything. So I still have a problem. Then you said Hammurabi, and then I think before you also said something about the Battle of Kadesh, which Hammurabi wasn't the king during the Battle of Kadesh.
No, of course not. No, it was Ramses II.
Well, yeah, Ramses II. We're talking about Egypt, but I'm saying,
Egypt, yeah.
I'm saying the king of Babylon or Mesopotamia at the time that the Battle of Kadesh occurs is not Hammurabi.
No, totally not. But just to close the point on the conversion. So I found two tablets, because you can fix the date like this misconversion by multiplying by 0.6. I show a number of examples, and if you multiply all the dates of the Old Testament by 0.6, so you're not being selective. You just multiply every.
Well, yeah, you'd have to, correct. Date. I agree with that.
And you end up lining up things. So, for instance, the Exodus. So, if we want to talk about the Exodus, I agree that there was no migration of hundreds of thousands of Israelites out of Egypt.
True.
However, there's multiple ways in the Bible to calculate the date of the Exodus, and none of them matches. So they kind of go, one will point here, the other one will point there. But when you multiply the date by 0.6, they all match and they all fit to the exact same point, which is the Battle of Kadesh. Okay. Now, the Battle of Kadesh, you have to realize that Canaan was a vassal state of Egypt.
Yeah, I know that.
Right.
And they were fighting the Hittites.
Right. So, if you obviously I don't believe there was a God involved in Exodus or anything like that, but if we just look at it as an important event for the people of Canaan, time after which Egypt retrieved from Canaan. So Canaan became more and more independent after that war. And so
but the war itself was not against Canaan. It was against the Hittites. We're actually in Turkey and northern Syria, and basically
Tudiluya.
Yeah, Tipidaluya, yeah.
King. Right. Yeah, but the net result of this peace agreement between Egypt and the Hittites is the fact that Egypt withdraw from Canaan. And so Canaan...
And that says in the Hittite thing, because I don't remember that particular saying they have to... Because I think they were saying about not actually being in Syria, because Egypt was all the way fighting up there. And so neither of them, I think, take Syria. They basically leave it as a buffer zone. I agree the secondary benefit of that is that below Syria is Canaan. And obviously there's going to be... because Egypt can have more of a desire to stay south. I still think they were in Canaan, because I think there's evidence of them
in Canaan for a while, but I think it's the moment in history that things started shifting, and Canaan slowly regained their own autonomy, and I think that's what Exodus refers to, and so we don't need to look for Canaan leaving Egypt as much as Egypt slowly releasing control. So you can see that as Canaanites being slaves of Egypt, they were vassal of Egypt. And after this,
well, it's a funny thing too is that actually DNA-wise, that especially for northern Egypt, there's not much distinction between them and the people from Iran, Turkey, and Canaan. That the DNA, there's DNA in the mummies but I don't know about all Egypt because they haven't checked or can't get DNA from all of them. But the ones in the North Egypt, they have strong connections to.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean DNA-wise, I mean they're not exactly the same people, but they're definitely from a connected branch of those people.
Right. I mean, there's something else interesting in this Exodus is the story of the Red Sea, right, where Moses opens his arm and Pharaoh's, the Israelites can escape, and then the chariots of Pharaohs are being drawn. Well, when you look at the Temple of Luxor and you read the text of Ramses II, it's called the Poem of Pantor, and it describes, Ramses II claims victory, and obviously it was a peace treaty, so nobody won after this war, but the description of the story of the victory of Ramses II, what I'm trying to show in my book is that the same key ideas are found in Exodus 14, which is basically that story. So the idea that the chariots are drowning, that Pharaoh positioned his troops in the north, and basically the whole description of what happens in the Bible.
Do you have a link to that also, so that everyone can read it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating that it's the same key idea. It's not the same text. It's a very different text. But if you look for the main ideas, they're in the same sequence, in the same order, and you see a parallel. So again, I believe that there's more connection to the history of the region in the Bible than when you look at it as a religious text and you just see God in it, then obviously it makes no sense. But when you try to understand how the evolution of the history of the region maps into the Bible, that's what I'm trying to do, and show that there's actually continuity. And, like this...
Speaking of continuity, the Bible didn't start in the exile. The Bible started in Canaan. It was written, in a sense, in basically pictograph Hebrew or sort of a Paleolithic Hebrew, which actually was, in a sense, a version of Canaanite or Phoenician, which itself is kind of a loan stuff, some of it from Egypt. So, I mean,
the mines of turquoise.
Right. So, because there is stuff about the Bible that starts, or at least the same Hebrew language, in a sense, starts before they ever went over. Like God El was from Canaan, and El is a bullhead with the symbol pictographic Hebrew. El is a bullhead, which relates to Egypt's concept. And the bullhead, and then a staff, controller. So it means strong controller is what El means in pictographic Hebrew. And so my point is that it already was a religion, in a sense, even before the Abraham story I'm talking about, what you're saying. Because my point is, if the Abraham story, as you say, was written over in Mesopotamia, I'm trying to think, during the Babylonian exile, I don't see how they would, if that's where the invention of the entire religion, then they wouldn't use El, because El had to do with the pre-existing stuff. So it wasn't so even let's just assume for a second that what you say is true. There was an actual person that in the Babylonian exile that had these ideas. He would have already started with a pre-existing idea of the El God. And it certainly is continued throughout the Bible. Because there's 150 times that just El, not Elohim, but just El is mentioned.
El Shaddai.
You're right, El Shaddai. Well, in fact, El Shaddai is what it says. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was El Shaddai. So
exactly.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't say anything to me that could relate to the idea of Lord as a person. Because like Baal, in fact, Baal is even mentioned positively because there's some people that were naming themselves Baal in the Jewish Hebrew Bible,
Absolutely.
Old Testament. But Baal is where they get the idea for like Lord. And I don't know that, like, the problem is Adonai, I know, is translated to Lord. It shouldn't be. It's because these are two different concepts in a sense. One is relating more to a deity. The one is a little more general. And so I think that it's important because if for say that Hammurabi was the Lord, right? So the Lord would have been Baal. So he would have said Baal.
Yes.
If he was mentioning that. But Baal is not mentioned, at that place.
Okay, so in Exodus 6:3, Moses or God basically says Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't know me under the name Yahweh.
Right, under El Shaddai.
Exactly, God the Almighty. And so my suggestion is that at the time of Abraham, the Lord was referred to as Baal. And in fact, if you look around Shechem, which is where Abraham lived, there's the temple of Baal Berith, right? So we have this deity, archaeology, called Baal Berith that the Bible refers to. We have the temple in Nablus, and this temple was erected exactly after the reign of King Hammurabi, and the temple of Baal Berith, in Hebrew, Baal Berith means Lord of Covenant, right? And scholars can't explain what the origin of this deity is. I believe that was the original deity that Abraham or the descendants of Abraham worship. The context was the cult of the dead or the cult of the ancestors. And it was common at the time to worship the memory of your dead. Even, people still do it today.
I think that there was, in Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, there's evidence of sky burials and probably ancestor worship going on.
Exactly.
So,
Right. And we know that, if you look, there's a number of authors that have looked into the Bible for the traces and the impact of the cult of the dead on the theology, and there's significant and valuable information there. But just in terms of Baal Berith, so we have this deity called Baal Berith, and at other places it's referred to as El Berith, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have Lord of Covenant that becomes the God of the Covenant. So I believe that it's just an evolution of this Lord who was initially worshipped just through the cult of the dead because of the deed to the land he gave to Abraham. And the descendants basically elevated the memory of this Lord into a god, into this Baal Berith, erected a temple and started worshiping him. Baal Berith is this pagan deity, right? That is the demon in the Bible. And yet, at the same time, Joshua, after the conquest, goes back to Shechem, to the same temple, the temple of Baal Berith, and reenacted the covenant with Abraham. But now it's Yahweh that he's worshiping. And I believe that Yahweh is a compounded deity that is embodying the characteristics of Baal Berith and Asherah. And this new Yahweh is a super deity because a compounded deity would basically kind of aggregate the characteristics of multiple gods and form a new god. And that's under the influence of Egyptians. And we have a numerous example of compounded deity in Canaan. And I believe that Yahweh is one compounded deity that originated from Baal and Asherah. And this, if you look at...
Well, I know there's a thing where Yahweh supposedly has Asher as his wife, and Asher was, I think, Baal's wife, or Baal's wife.
Exactly. Yeah. Asher has been, at times, she's seen as El's wife.
That's right.
Baal's wife, Yahweh's wife. But
one of the things that I think is that because the concept of Asher already existed. That's the actual older belief, not the male deity, but the female deity. And that's then, in a sense, put together with these new males that eventually, share her with everybody to give themselves credibility, and then they get rid of her totally and just, hey, it's just the guys.
Exactly. But
So, I mean, I do know you're talking about stuff changing, and I do think that also Yahweh sounds a lot like, if you read the Bible, there's plenty of verses, it sounds like a volcano. Because especially even when it talks about God lighting their way at night like a volcano would, or showing them a pillar of smoke in the day. I mean, he goes on top of the mountain, and then there's all this fire and brimstone. And then it says too, like that people tried to give offerings to the mountain, and God burned them all. I mean, yeah.
Well, I think there's a lot of syncretism going on, throughout history of religion, and obviously, we're looking at a time frame that spanned from, 1800 before Common Era, before Christ, all the way down to maybe 500 years before Christ, where the text pretty much settled. So we're looking at 1,300 years at the time when the amount of written information was extremely limited, right? So one of the things I try to demonstrate in my work is that the story of Abraham itself cannot have been passed down orally.
Well, I don't agree with that. It could have been. No, it could have been. Yes, it's absolutely. Well, in fact, there's I think it's an article that just came out recently about how the people in Australia, the Aborigines, how that they've had this story, spoken word, not written. This spoken word story of a volcano that happened, I think it was like 10,000 years ago or something. I can't remember, but because they had this story about this happening, this is nonsense. But they finally found that it's accurate. So maybe that story was relating to an accurate, event. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that makes all stories that are done orally be able to be transmitted. I'm just saying, but to say that it can't happen, I don't agree. There's evidence to the contrary. That it can happen. People can keep saying things. I mean, obviously, I think that's a good way that things can change, because if you try to tell ideas like, like the telephone, thing, that as you keep telling them, it's possible that you add or subtract important stuff. But
yeah, well, Jan van Sina wrote extensively on oral traditions, and his conclusion is that you can maintain the body of a story over time, but you lose the details, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
What I'm trying to show or argue is that there are details in the story that there are just too many details that don't add any value to the religious experience, to the religious text, and that only makes sense when you look at it as let's call it a secular covenant, okay? As I believe that was the case.
Yeah, but when you every time you use that word, though, that really irritates me, because it sounds like you're saying an atheist covenant. Because when you say secular, you're talking about a thing that's non-religious. But if a person is deifying the person they're having the covenant with,
Abraham didn't deify.
Oh, so you're saying that Abraham did not deify? He just had this covenant. Someone later deified it.
Exactly.
Oh.
Yes, the descendants of Abraham deified the memory of this Lord. Okay.
I thought you were saying that Abraham's covenant was secular, but he had a deity belief.
No.
Like, dude, no, that you
okay.
It's two separate things.
Sorry, I agree with you. Yeah. So.
Okay, well, yeah.
And what I'm arguing is that there are two figures in the text. There's a material figure and there's a anthropomorphic figure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the religion, we conflate these two, and Yahweh and Elohim, anthropomorphic and material, it's all one and the same God. What I'm trying to show is that statistically, when you look at the...
well, anthropomorphic, so people know, anthropomorphic means having human features or human characteristics.
Yes.
Which is not limited to, I'm just saying, but if that's not limited, most of the Mesopotamian deities were very anthropomorphic. They drank alcohol, they raped people, they killed people, they had children,
But they also usually have supernatural power.
Oh yeah, they live on top of a mountain in the clouds or whatever. Yeah.
Now, what I'm arguing is that Yahweh, or not Yahweh, the anthropomorphic figure in the story of Abraham doesn't have any supernatural power, and only the immaterial figure has some supernatural power. And I believe, again, and that when you do a careful analysis of the occurrences and you map the name Yahweh over the anthropomorphic figure and you map Elohim over the immaterial figure, what you find in the text is this, call it secular covenant made with this Lord, and you understand why the covenant was made, and you realize that...
I know, but hold on a second. So are you saying that these two figures came about at the exact same time? Because the reason I'm asking is because scholars debate like the writing of Genesis to having more than one author, right? I'm sure you probably know about this. So one of the authors is basically big into El and Elohim and all that, and the other one is Yaris that comes later. So when it starts, it's not, and then it changes.
Right. Well, I believe, and that's the documentary hypothesis of Julian Wellhausen that you're referring to, that started out as Julian Wellhausen and evolved. But I believe that strictly for the story of Abraham, you cannot use, that method is flawed and cannot be used to properly analyze the text.
Even though the story says that El was his, name for God?
I think you have to look at it as the anthropomorphic versus the material figure. And then you can, because the names have been changed. And what I try to explain, and I use statistics to demonstrate that there's 93% chance that these two names...
How did you get to that? I mean, saying a number sounds great, but I mean, how exactly, what method did you use? What sources did you use to reach that conclusion? In other words, also, is it a valid tool that can be used for other things, or is it one that you're limiting to this source?
It's limiting to this source. It's basically, it's looking at just the occurrence of... So we have four things. We have Yahweh, we have Elohim, we have an anthropomorphic figure, and we have an immaterial figure, right? If the scribes were using the terms Yahweh and Elohim interchangeably...
So when you say anthropomorphic figure, you mean one that's human-like?
Yeah, exactly.
And then when you're saying the other one is what exactly? Supernatural?
Immaterial. I call it immaterial, right? So
I just want to clarify how you're using those terms. So you're saying one is a human in a sense. I'm for people listening, because not everybody is. I know these words.
That's very good. So what I do is I look at the text. So if the verse says Yahweh spoke or told Abraham something, or Yahweh made a covenant in Genesis 12 to 25, it's mostly Yahweh that is the figure that is there. And
then they're using Lord for Yahweh, correct? Translated?
Oh, sorry. Yes, exactly. So in the English translation, it's translated often, well, even in the, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, it's translated as Lord and God. Elohim is translated into God, and Yahweh is translated into Lord. But in the Masoretic Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, we still have Yahweh and Elohim. But that part is not very critical. The idea is that you have, I guess I agree with you, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are two names, whether it is God,
I agree with the two names, yes.
Elohim and Yahweh.
That's correct.
And there's two type of figure. One that is anthropomorphic, that Abraham interacts with, eats with, talks with, etc.
Well, also for people to know, real quick. Also, people know that Baal is El's son, so Jesus being, or Yahweh, whatever, being a son, it's interesting.
There's lots of parallels there, and so when you see how the names map the characters, and in a random distribution, you would expect that if I have 60% occurrence of Yahweh and 40% occurrences of Elohim in the text, if it was a random distribution or close to a random distribution, I should have approximately the same distribution on anthropomorphic and immaterial figure. Now, what I'm trying to show is that the mapping of the Lord over the anthropomorphic.
What do you mean by mapping by over? You're saying how many times it occurs, correct?
Yes.
Well, I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 135 occurrences of these terms in the text, and out of those 135 occurrences, I look at how many of them match the name with the anthropomorphic and
when you say 135, are you saying 135 in the story of Abraham or 135 in the Bible?
No, just Genesis 12 to 25.
Okay.
That's where I'm looking.
I'm going to go look into that too, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. And what I'm trying to show is that there's a super skew towards Yahweh being anthropomorphic, and also is another skew of Elohim and immaterial. So you would normally expect Elohim to be much more immaterial, Yahweh to be much more material, but as it turns out, the number of errors is extremely low on Yahweh and extremely high on Elohim.
What do you mean by errors? You mean the fact that it doesn't...
Errors, meaning, again, I look at it as the Lord is anthropomorphic, and that's what you would expect to find. If the premise of Abraham making a covenant with the Lord is immortal, is a human, you would expect that human to be anthropomorphic, right?
No,
so
yeah.
You would expect...
you mean human-like, yeah.
Yahweh to be anthropomorphic all the time, and you would expect Elohim to be immaterial all the time. But that's not what we have. And so you have to look at what we have and analyze statistically what are the odds of this, the current, what are the odds of this compared to randomness, right? Because randomness would be the alternative. And so what I'm showing...
Well, no, the alternative would be that they believed that both were gods. What I'm saying is you're saying that the only other option is that in a sense it's random that they're doing this. But if we take the position as it's offered that I don't agree with gods, but obviously he's an atheist. But I'm just saying how they present them. If they present both of them as gods, that is an option of presenting. Or the option that they just randomly mixed something together, and then you're thinking that it relates to a person. I'm just saying there's not just either or. It's not black and white for me.
Correct. And at that point in my analysis, I'm not assuming it is immortal. I'm actually just saying there are two characters. And then after that, I'm addressing the question of, now that we have two characters, is Yahweh immortal, or could he be a god, just like one of the deities you mentioned earlier? Zeus or whatever,
right.
That were Greek. And so the idea is to demonstrate that, I'm just trying to explain briefly.
Well, no, I know. Well, this is not a debate, so I'm not expecting you to have all the stuff, and I'm not trying to wage a campaign against your beliefs. Yeah, I'm just saying that.
Just so you can have fun.
I'm just saying that what you say, your conclusion, I have real issues with, and on all kinds of levels. And now, one of the levels I thought I had, maybe you've addressed, the secular thing. That really was irritating me. That someone says that someone hero worshipped someone into a god, and that's a secular covenant. But now I see that it was just me not understanding what you were saying. That you mean secular covenant being that he was an actual person. Later, someone else anthropomorphized, or deified this, supposed covenant with a person. Right. So I mean, that was definitely one that was going, oh man, you got to be kidding me. What do you mean secular and religious?
There's the few things I would say is that and thank you for being challenging in your inquiry, because I find a number of discussions, but they're not really challenging and the whole idea is that I find that there is such an abundance of material that leads you to conclude differently. But what has amazed me in all those years that I've been investigating this is I found nobody else who's ever investigated the possibility that Abraham made a covenant with a mortal. You can look in the literature.
Right, but 1 second on that point. Before the ancient aliens conspiracy theory came about, nobody had really addressed that ancient aliens could be the origin of all religion. So my point is, though, just because something hasn't been done doesn't mean it's accurate. I mean, wild ideas can come about just as much as ones that are reasonable. Just like someone said to me, I call everything in this, to me, in a sense, after Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago, I see as a early forming of paganism. And I mean paganism in its loose sense, as far as that it's a polytheistic, nature-based, in a sense, cares about the seasons and all that, type of shamanistic, totemistic, animistic thinking. And so someone said, well,
and when you separate these two characters in the story of Abraham, you realize that the deity that is remaining is that pagan deity that is worshipped for fertility, that is worshipped for, and the way it is worshipped is exactly the way the context you would expect the context. So just to touch on the ancient alien, nothing about ancient aliens rationally makes sense. Right? When you look in the historical context, there's absolutely nothing that tells you, oh yeah, there were aliens back then.
No, true.
Now, when you look into this, all I'm trying to do is look at the context. What should we expect to find? Well, we would expect to find a covenant made between a Mesopotamian and this guy.
When you say covenant, are you talking about the Ten Commandments covenant, or are you
just a political treaty, where
because I was going to say that the Ten Commandments does seem like a treaty because some of the treaties from Turkey, which I said DNA-wise, that the Ashkenazi Jews come from, that they have treaties that do sound, because it mentions this, do this, don't do this, whatever. It sounds a lot like the Ten Commandments, or at least you could see where that could come from that.
Yes. Yeah, and I show examples of different treaties of the Bronze Age, and it's the closest thing. And again, when scholars look at parallels between the Abrahamic Covenant and ancient treaties, the biggest challenge they
sorry, when you say Abrahamic Covenant, could you clarify what you mean by that?
Well, the story of Abraham is all about.
Well, it says that God gave him the land, right? So God gave him the rights to the land, but it says that your people will multiply, and the world will be benefited from you, and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you found in similar treaties at the time. The big difference, and the reason scholars today hesitate and cannot really make parallels between the Abrahamic Covenant, what's unique about it is that normally in those treaties, you'd have the two party were kings or humans, and the deity was a witness to the treaty. In the covenant with Abraham,
I'm not looking at one specifically, but I've read stuff and that doesn't sound unreasonable.
Yeah. And in the story of Abraham, we have Abraham making a covenant with a deity, and that's what threw people off. But if I look at it, and the way I'm looking at it is basically, no, he made a covenant with a Lord, and then that covenant makes sense. It's similar to a land grant covenant that were done at the time. So there's nothing inordinary about that.
Well, I can agree that I don't think there's anything magical ever occurred in the land of Canaan or anywhere else. So I do think anywhere. So I do agree with an underlining premise that it was all natural things that people explained different or flat out lied about or made stories up about or thought that they were making stories up maybe to teach something. And the story was known to be false, and then later people just believe it as true. So, but that's a general persuasion of understanding. That's not actually support for a claim that a specific person lived and a specific person had a specific idea or a specific interaction. Also, to me, let's assume that what you said is correct. Again, because I like to do this. This is how I like to assume almost everything you say and then still show you is wrong. So if we assume that everything you said, why would the King Hammurabi actually give this one person, who even when he fights against supposedly the kings in his own story, he has 318 or 330 or something people?
318, yeah.
Okay, that's not that many people. I mean, it's not like, in other words, it would make more sense if Hammurabi told the Hittites, hey, you know what? We both don't like Egypt. I'm going to give you Canaan, or I'll help you protect Canaan if it's attacked. That would be more reasonable. I'm just saying you're talking about historical figures. Shupadilimio.
Abraham is in the land.
I know, but I'm saying, but Shupadilimio and Hammurabi talking in a treaty that gives them Canaan, that I would find to be a lot more plausible. But just some random person who him by himself explains that he's actually of low means, even though obviously having a bunch of goats and 300 people, you're a small little chieftain, dude. You're still, you're nowhere near, because let's think about it. Like I know, off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly, but I think it was like 10,000 people in Ur and over in Mesopotamia in the city. So 300 people couldn't even take that city. And so why would a person who's over more than just 10,000, because that's just one of the cities, he's over multiple cities in an entire area, why exactly would he make a deal with someone who has, not even 500 people to take over a whole land? I mean, King Hammurabi.
I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I believe that Abraham, by rescuing the people of Sodom, has an ascendant on them. So he was respected. He's been celebrated by the people of Sodom for returning victorious. So perhaps King Hammurabi or whoever, and by the way, I'm not totally stuck on King Hammurabi. I just find he's the most likely candidate to have made the...
But when you say most likely, you could say that the king of Egypt was the most likely, since he actually in the story interacts directly, supposedly, which I don't agree that happened either, but supposedly with the Pharaoh. So, I mean, if you were going to say he picked someone, and certainly the Pharaoh himself would have said, I am the son of a god, or I am half god, or I am God, period. I mean, so, I mean, I could, he already had,
different possibilities, including some Egyptian pharaohs and whatnot that have reigned during those times, and tried to kind of go and see them, check them in review and see what, in terms of their expansion or political hegemony, or the way they would control themselves, they would expand their empire, if they would make those valid candidates, and then look into the details of their dates and what happened and how they came to power and all that. And
because I know that Hammurabi, didn't he become deified by his son, or after his death? And I think his son, or was his son the one that started being a deity halfway through his reign or something like that? I can't remember, but
it's unclear, because Naram-Sin and there's a number of Mesopotamian kings that were deified while they were alive. Hammurabi is more nebulous. It's not clear. He certainly didn't think of himself as a god.
My point was that while he was alive, that was my biggest point. While he was alive, so if someone had met him as a person while he was alive, that he himself didn't, and as far as I remember, I don't, or something like that.
Before him and after him, but we know there are traces of evidence showing that some people would consider Hammurabi as a king, as a god, Hammurabi El, or Hammurabi Eli, my god. So there are references to that, but there's a number of challenges with Hammurabi as well. One is that there are no evidence that he's ever had influence over Canaan, right? So there's no historical treaty, there's no record showing that his power extended over Canaan. So that's a challenge in itself that I haven't been able to overcome. But I think I tried to...
That's why I was saying, if he had made a treaty with someone who actually almost could take power in the area, like the Hittites, that would make more sense than it would.
But the Hittite took power many centuries later. So at the time, first of all, I don't think they were very friendly with the Babylonians.
No, because the Babylonians were going up into southern Turkey and taking land, or at least starting with outposts and stuff. So, yeah, I'm sure they were. Yeah. So that even more so seems odd that, and let's just say to me too, if Hammurabi would have told somebody, "I'm going to give you this land," that wouldn't be like free and clear. You can have it. That would be more like, I'm going to set you up like America does in southern, America Republicans, go down there and go, well, we would rather have this guy be the leader, so we're going to have, this puppet, whatever, in a sense,
And I think that's what happened. And, I don't know if you want to go down to this level of detail, but when you look into the story in the, and you go down to the detail of the text, what you realize is that Sarah is barren. She can't have a son, right, for Abraham. So Abraham, she basically sends Hagar, her Egyptian maid, to Abraham. And Abraham has a
thoughtful wife.
Hey?
I said thoughtful wife.
Yes, thank you. So he has a son, Ishmael, which is the firstborn. So technically he should be the one inheriting. But the Lord is not happy. He says, no, you're going to have a son with Sarah. And
you believe, let's just go with your claim. Hammurabi told him, you're going to have a son.
Yes, yeah. And because at the time, the treaties were made not between regions, they were made between individuals, right? And so Abraham...
Well, usually individuals with power. That's where I still keep having an issue with Abraham wasn't a person of power, so I don't even see why someone of power would even give him...
Well, I think he had more power than the Bible leads us to believe. He buys the cave of Machpelah for multiple kilograms of silver. Which is it's a bit of money. So anyway, the idea is that and Canaan, just to go back to where was I to? Oh yeah, to the story with Ishmael. So Ishmael is supposed to be the first son. Lord tells Abraham, you're going to have a son with your wife, and then a little bit later in the story, he asks Abraham, where's your wife? He's in the tent. And then a little bit later, the Lord visits Sarah, does unto Sarah what he said he would do, and 9 months later, Sarah gives Abraham a son.
So Hammurabi goes to Sarah and tells her, you're going to have a son at 70 years old or 80 or 90 or whatever she was.
Well, no, because now we fixed the time. So she's 54, which is pretty old. But it is, it is reported as a miracle almost that she got pregnant. But at 54-year-old, it is technically possible for some women to give birth. It's not common at all. It's totally uncommon. But at least we're going from the realm of impossibility to a realm of, okay, it's unlikely, but let's say it could potentially happen. But the most important part is that the Lord has fathered Isaac.
I have another question too. Let's just assume that it is true, and that Hammurabi himself told them this stuff, and then they get a male child. You would think that you would then have strong ties with Mesopotamia at that point, because your supposed, even if it was a person, he prophetically said you're going to have a child, and then if you actually got a child back then, you would have seen it as, because they thought they were never going to happen. So if the story is relating to an actual person, then an actual person made a supposed prophecy that then supposedly comes true, and then after that, you don't hear anything that's relating towards we appreciate, the Mesopotamians, or we believe. I find it, hard to see how that's. If you had received supposedly what this person had said, your reverence for them would be a lot higher, and not just the.
Well, as long as you believe it was a man.
I don't believe it was a man. That's the.
No. As long as you're a descendant of Abraham, right? As a descendant of Abraham. So let me finish on the story of Isaac. So if Isaac was fathered by this king, right, then we have a problem in Genesis 22, because the Lord asked Abraham to sacrifice his son to show his loyalty, right? And so in that story, we have, the Bible tells us that he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And when I first ran into that 15 years ago, I thought, and that was one of the trigger that almost made me back up from this idea, because I thought, well, if God, it doesn't make any sense that if the Lord fathered Isaac, that he asked Abraham to show his loyalty by sacrificing Isaac. It just makes no sense.
Right, because he probably was schizophrenic.
Yeah, so the whole idea collapses. Or, unless he didn't ask to sacrifice Isaac, but he asked to sacrifice Ishmael. Then it would make sense, because Ishmael is the firstborn. He'd be normally entitled to inherit, and he wants Isaac, which is his own seed.
No, yeah, well, that would make sense in a thing, but the whole point is it doesn't do that. So the story doesn't do that. I agree that would make sense, and I think it's odd, but I can see why. So if the
story does,
the story basically to me promotes that you need to love God so much. Jesus even says this. He says if you don't hate your mother and father, your children and your friends, your very life.
Sorry, you can't bring Jesus 2,000 years before.
No, I'm saying it's the same
concept to the story of Abraham.
No, but I'm saying the concept of loving God so much that everything could die and you still love God.
Yes.
Is I'm saying
everything you're saying falls out of the Abrahamic story.
But the Abrahamic no, it doesn't. How does it fall outside? Abraham is going to kill his child for God, correct or no?
Yes.
So that's not. So well, a second. That's not then unreasonable. If I say that Jesus says you need to love God more than your own self, more than your very life, more than your children, that's exact. Yeah. Aren't you loving God in the Abraham story more than your child?
Yes, exactly.
Because you're going to kill your child. So it's wrong that you say that it's outside of. It's addressing the big theme. You talked about looking from the big theme. The big theme is Jesus says your own life doesn't matter, only God does. Abraham behaves in a way that his own child doesn't matter, only God does.
Right. All I'm saying is that the story of Jesus came out of the story of Abraham, not the other way around.
But see, that's not a claim I made. Did not say.
Well, that's a claim I made. That's a claim I made.
But I'm saying, but you said I was wrong. I'm saying I'm not wrong. It is the exact same thing. Jesus says your own life doesn't matter. You should worship God. Abraham said that his own child didn't matter. God was more important. So I'm saying it was the same concept that God is more important than human life.
Yes. And perhaps priests have looked at Abraham and that story to make those claims subsequently. But the issue here is that if the Lord cannot ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, because that's still a problem, right? If the Lord fathered Isaac, it doesn't make sense that he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac.
Right.
And when I first ran into that, I thought, well, here we've got a problem. And my first reaction was to look, well, maybe somebody else has suggested that perhaps it was not Isaac but Ishmael. That was the son that that God asked Abraham to sacrifice. And I had no idea at the time. That was 15 years ago. But I immediately found that, yeah, Muslims agree on the whole story of Abraham, except on that very particular point. For the Muslims, in their tradition, it's Ishmael that God asks to sacrifice, not Isaac. And so they agree on things except that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting, because I come to the same conclusion for totally different reasons.
But that still doesn't mean it's accurate. You could have an opinion that matches a opinion in a different faith. That doesn't mean that either of them is correct, or even that the story is. It all could be wrong. You could be wrong. The story is wrong, and the Muslims are wrong. Or one of you is right. I mean, or two of you have some elements that are right, or all three have elements that are somewhat right and wrong. I mean, I'm just saying it's not like it's always black and white on things.
You're totally right. I mean, that's what science is all about. It's about testing arguments, testing hypotheses, and see where it fails.
Right, and then the other thing of science is that hypotheses that are not worthy are rejected.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've been pushing, pulling, tearing this hypothesis for the last 15 years, and it just keeps solidifying itself. Every argument that seems shaky to start with, when you start digging into it, you realize that's actually a better solution. There's a better solution, and so that's kind of where I'm at today.
Okay, well, I'm going to end the video, so go ahead and tell us where to get your stuff. I'll put a link in the blog I'm going to do. So just go ahead and say it anyways, but I'm going to add stuff. So.
Thank you. So the book is available both on Amazon and Smashwords, and as an ebook or paperback. The website is earthlycovenant.com, and there's a bunch of video. I just created a series of 7 videos kind of going over and explaining why scholars today have come to the conclusion that Abraham was a mythical character. And I go through their arguments and I show that it's actually a position that makes a lot of sense. And then I offer an alternative position, which is, why should we believe Abraham is a historical character? And I offer arguments to show why I believe we should look at him as a historical character. And so you can watch those videos, and they'll save you 400 pages of reading.
All right. Well, it was good talking to you, and maybe some other time I'll get more information than you can, and we'll do more closer to a debate about this some other time. Maybe even in the future. But anyways, I enjoyed the time talking to you, and I appreciate you being a guest. All right. Bye.